Back when the Disinformation Governance Board disbanded or paused 3 weeks ago, the explanation was that you rubes just didn't understand. This wasn't some shady censorship authority created for the purpose of monitoring Americans. This was just an innocent, well-intentioned effort to counter foreign propaganda. And they would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling conspiracy theorists. And that wasn't just the story from government officials. That was the story from the person who broke it, Taylor Lorenz, at the Washington Post. In between her sobbing self-pity over the mean tweets she endures and her courageous masked investigations into the family members of Twitter accounts she doesn't like, Lorenz scooped the story that the Disinformation Board was pausing and its leader Nina Jankowicz was resigning. And the explanation was not that the Disinformation Board was ill-conceived in concept, if not outright unconstitutional. The explanation was that you idiots just didn't understand it. It was right-wing attacks that derailed the board, not the board itself or the crazy-eyed Mary Poppins act from the lady picked to run it. You sensationalists claimed that this was going to be some Ministry of Truth-style censorship board, but that is not the case. In fact, the board would have no ability to declare what is true or false or compel any sort of censorship. No operational authority at all, Lorenz wrote. And how did she know? Well, she knows because she asked the government. A DHS spokesperson said the board's purpose has been grossly mischaracterized. It will not police speech, quite the opposite. Its focus is to ensure that freedom of speech is protected, actually. Lorenz quotes the official in the story. Well, if Uncle Sam says so, then who could possibly dispute Rule 1 for good journalism? Assume the government is lying. Not only is it almost always true, but it's faithful to the entire reason for journalism's constitutional protection as a public institution. Good journalism is a check on government power, not a megaphone for it. And the government lying would have been a good assumption in this case, just like any other, because as it turns out, that DHS spokesman was, or at least was mischaracterizing the design and purpose of this board. Protecting your freedom was never the intent. Correcting your viewpoint was, and that's no longer speculation about the worst of government motives. That's documented in the Department of Homeland Security's own communication. It's information newly released by a DHS whistleblower giving documents to Senators Hawley and Grassley, materials the senators have now publicly published and sent with a letter of questions to Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, the man overseeing the whole operation. The documents include a memo to Mayorkas from September last year describing the initial organizational concepts and purposes for the board, another memo for Mayorkas in January in which Mayorkas approved a formal charter for the board, which Mayorkas signed at the end of February to formalize the board's establishment, and some briefing notes for a meeting with Twitter at the end of April, among other materials. And what these documents show is that the sanitized explanation for the board they were pushing was simply not true. It was not an effort to go after foreign threats. It was an effort to go after you. It wasn't some half-baked idea that was poorly announced before it was finished. It was something they had already built. And by all indications, this was not going to be just some counter-messaging effort to fight bad information with good information. This board was working with social media companies on a variety of censorship efforts we were told it had absolutely nothing to do with. Full demonstration that when you see the quote description, government spokesperson says, that's code for the opposite is actually true. The first lie was the entire concept of the board. Recall, after Mayorkas announced the project before a congressional committee, he said several times, this isn't about monitoring American citizens. This is just about monitoring foreign disinformation, specifically that of Russian origin and also that given to migrants to encourage illegal immigration.
Will American citizens be monitored?
No. What it will do is gather together best practices in addressing the threat of disinformation from foreign state adversaries, from the cartels.
But if Russian and cartel disinformation are the organizing issue for which this board was created, it's pretty weird those things aren't a priority in the board's organizing documents. Indeed, the first memo to Mayorkas to explain the need for this board makes no mention of Russia at all, and has immigration disinformation listed only after more important falsehoods that DHS is worried about, the serious homeland security risks that are questioning the validity of the election and disinformation related to vaccine and mask efficacy. So do they mean that it's only dangerous if Russians or the cartels talk about these things? That would be an awfully specific constraint that's described nowhere in the memo and doesn't make logical sense anyway. Why would we care if the cartels say that masks don't work or that the election was a fraud? How does that affect immigration? It doesn't. The simple explanation is the one they told us was false. This board was organized to monitor this so-called disinformation no matter where it comes from, including from your American fingers typing on your American Twitter or Facebook accounts. When they said they weren't going to monitor you, the American citizen, that was a lie. In fact, monitoring you was page 1, bullet point 1 of their organizing documents. Also recall that Mayorkas repeatedly characterized the board as just a working group, not even anything formally organized.
This small working group within the Department of Homeland Security, the board, this working group, internal working group.
And Mayorkas said before a Senate committee that the board hadn't even started its work.
Senator, there are not yet this governance board.
Wait a minute. There are no minutes of meetings about this board?
It is not yet.
You've not created any records?
It has not yet begun its work.
That statement was made under oath, by the way. And that's lie number 2. We can now see there were several back and forth organizational memos, and they created a formal charter for the board that Mayorkas personally reviewed and signed months before he made that statement. As we'll get to, the board had scheduled a meeting with Twitter executives, and of course, Nina Jankowicz was selected to lead the board. All of this was work done before Mayorkas said there was ever any at all. And on Jankowicz, this documentation offers possible insight as to why she was picked. Sure, she has all the legendary cringe and the disdain for everyday Americans to make a great bureaucrat, but outside of those base level qualifications, it hasn't been clear why exactly she was selected. She was an all but total unknown before her selection, just an author of a couple books that sold something similar to Jill Biden biography numbers. Jankowicz didn't even have a Wikipedia page until her selection to run this board. So why her? Well, according to these documents, she also had connections with Twitter. Both Twitter's head of policy and head of site integrity, parties to this meeting that was scheduled, knew and had prior relationships with Nina Jankowicz. And the date of this Twitter meeting demonstrates what could be yet another lie. After the board's public announcement on April 27th, Senator Hawley sent a letter with a series of questions to DHS. DHS responded, telling him the board had not been discussed with any external entities prior to the public announcement, and yet a meeting with Twitter was scheduled and organized for the very next day, April 28th. Now, is it possible that Mayorkas publicly announced this board on a Wednesday and then immediately went to Twitter and had a full meeting scheduled and organized for the very next day, Thursday? Yeah, that's possible. But is it likely? Not at all. Given this documentation, the board was almost certainly talking to Twitter before the formal public announcement, and DHS just lied to Hawley about the timeline. And speaking of that Twitter meeting, its content or its intended content looks like lie number 3. Recall Mayorkas and DHS spokesman had insisted this board would have no authority to censor or take action against American speech. But this Twitter meeting looks like yet another effort to outsource that action rather than avoid it. It's not actually clear this meeting ever happened, but based on the documentation, its intent was clear. The objective was to operationalize a public-private partnership between DHS and Twitter and to set up channels for sharing information. DHS just wants to help Twitter's own counter-disinformation efforts, the meeting briefing says. Well, that sure sounds a lot like Jen Psaki saying previously, we don't do the censorship ourselves, we just flag things for Mark Zuckerberg to censor, but it's him hitting the delete key, not us. We just help.
In terms of actions, Alex, that we have taken, or we're working to take, I should say, from the federal government, we've increased disinformation research and tracking within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook.
And of course, if you don't trust these people to accurately define what is or is not true or false, good information or disinformation, that's good instinct. But there's another small detail in these documents that should make us even more skeptical. According to their own definitions, they are looking to counter and control information that's actually true. The board was organized to address what the documents call misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, or MDM. This is section 1 of the board's charter that Mayorkas approved. Perhaps you've heard of misinformation, defined as false information not created or shared with the intent of causing harm. Disinformation, defined as false information shared or created with the intent of causing harm. But what is malinformation? It's information that is based on fact, but used out of context to mislead, harm, or manipulate. Yeah, in other words, it's true, they just don't like that particular piece of truth. And if you're curious about an example of what such a thing would be, something that's true but still misleading, DHS has yet to provide one that I've seen in response to media inquiry, but a 2019 DHS publication adds a little more detail. Malinformation is true, but typically private or revealing information that may cause reputational damage. So I guess think Hunter Biden's laptop. True, but damaging, therefore it must be suppressed. It was a conspiracy theory to say that these people wanted control of even true information, and yet here they were admitting that the whole time. We were laughably told it was disinformation that sank the disinformation board. Number one, that means they're bad at their jobs. They couldn't defeat what they were assigned to defeat. But number two, why then has all the supposed disinformation come true upon investigation? And it's tempting and comforting to think that maybe for once, truth and justice won the day. Nina Jankowicz rightly disappeared. This board stopped doing the work that it supposedly wasn't doing anyway, and the government actually properly responded to a polite reminder that it exists to secure and defend our rights, not to infringe on them. Well, if only things were so rosy. Remember, the board has been paused, not eliminated. And the term pause implies a resuming later. Indeed, the two new people that DHS has selected to lead the board after Jankowicz's departure are former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff and former Deputy U.S. Attorney General Jamie Gorelick. And they've been instructed not to dismantle, but to strategize on how DHS can garner public trust with its disinformation efforts. So not ending the mission and not changing the mission, but just getting you to believe in the mission. That's the idea. And I wouldn't count on polite persuasion to be the tactic of choice. Chertoff is one of the co-authors of the Patriot Act, which of course expanded warrantless government surveillance in numerous ways. And Gorelick was responsible for a policy of separating and obstructing communications between foreign intelligence agencies and the FBI, which many, including the 9/11 Commission, say was partly responsible for the 9/11 attacks. So a dream team of authoritarianism and incompetence, organized for the purpose of not just undermining your constitutional rights, but doing it as poorly as possible. So there's no reason for optimism based on who's now running the operation, but we don't need to forecast based on that information anyway. It's one step ahead. If we want to predict how this board will work in the future, look no further than how it's worked in the past. In secret. All the organizing these new documents reveal was happening behind the scenes for months. If they view the problem as just PR and not the organizational purpose of the board itself, the new leadership's recommendation won't be the elimination of the board. It won't even be better advertising. It'll just be to put the board back where it belongs, behind closed doors where all government abuse functions best. I would say keep an eye on it, but that's kind of the point. The design is so you can't. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christensen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.